Welcome to yet another exciting episode of Business Africa, where we tell stories of daring entrepreneurs and promising fortunes. I'm your host, Afolake Oyiloye. The top stories this week. It's been massively underfunded for a long time, but it is time now for African countries to grow their economies by closing the science and technology gap with the rest of the world. On this episode, we hear it from the horse's mouth. Congolese microfinance giant Crédit Mutuel d'Afrique came crashing along over 300,000 euros of over 600 customers swindled. Microfinance fraud is becoming a trend in the sub-region. What would that translate to? We'll talk to a financial analyst. The impact of the COVID-19 prevention measures are still affecting global supply chains. In Africa, reduced import of critical supplies like medicines and cooking gas are causing worrying shortages. China and the United States accounted for 63% of the growth in spending in science from 2014 to 2018. They also are the world's two biggest economies. On the other hand, there is no African countries that spends more than 1% of its GDP on scientific research. The continent accounts for a paltry 3% of global economy. Could there be a connection between investment in science and economic development? Let's find out.
Under 2% of the population in African lower-income countries have been vaccinated against COVID-19. This is in contrast to over 60% of people in advanced economies. Vaccine hoarding and selfishness by more developed countries has been blamed for this life-threatening gap, but inevitable questions have been asked about the continent's inability to produce its own vaccines or medicine. The numbers clearly demonstrate the huge gap between Africa and the rest of the world in terms of scientific research, technological development and innovation. Only 0.1% of all patent applications are registered in Africa, compared to 65% in Asia and 25% in North America. Africa is also responsible for only 2% of the world's research output and 1% of research spending. Furthermore, Africa has 11 researchers per million people, while the best performing countries in the world, such as South Korea and Denmark, had between 7,000 to 8,000 scientists and researchers per million people. This is quite absurd considering that many of the continent's challenges like climate change, food insecurity and pandemics like Ebola and COVID-19 can be effectively resolved by science. Several analysts now are hopeful that the implementation of the free trade market in Africa will close the continent's hinged scientific and technological gap with the rest of the world and sustainably produce the right set of skills to expand both extra and intra-African trade.
We speak to Professor Amina Gurib-Fakim, the first female president of Mauritius. Welcome to the show and thank you for making out time for this interview. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded us in Africa on why it is important to invest in science. With nearly all African countries spending less than 1% of their GDP on scientific research, what are the chances of Africa becoming self-sufficient in medicine?
For too long, on the African landscape, we haven't really looked at higher education. So if we are going now to look at medicine, if we are going to look at the development of pharmaceutical products, the first question we need to ask ourselves is, where will that be done? Where is the ecosystem that will kind of prioritize this kind of research, which will eventually give us the medicine that we need through partnership within Africa and, of course, outside Africa? And so we really need to relook at our institution, especially the higher education landscape of our continent. So let us take stock of what we understand as for higher education, what we understand with research and development. It's only when we have answered this question that we will see clearer in terms of our strategy to working towards developing vaccines or any other drugs for that matter.
We know that you're hopeful that the AFCFTA can provide a unique opportunity for African economies to collaborate in the STEM fields. Please elaborate.
There is no doubt that the Africa Free Trade Agreement presents a unique opportunity, at least in trade to begin with. And there's another area where we also need to see to it that the research gets done on the continent is food production, ensuring food security, transformation of the raw material coming out of our agriculture. I mean, these actually present huge opportunity for creating jobs for the young people, and more importantly, ensure food security in an era where climate change is there and will impact through drought, will impact through flooding. So this is, again, a huge opportunity for our continent, but of course, provided we take care of the primary institutions where these transformation can stem from, and this, of course, is higher education.
What must be done to bridge the science and technology gap and enable production of vaccines and other life-saving medicines in Africa?
Well, we'll have to move very fast because I think already a few centers have been identified, and these centers, they have been identified, I presume, because of what is already happening there. So if we are going to promote these centers to emerge, we'll have to invest. We'll have to invest in the people, we'll have to invest in the infrastructure. And I think these centers which have been identified, they present huge opportunity for not just collaboration, but of course for these centers to be emulated elsewhere on the continent, because we need more of these. We are talking about 1.3 billion people. We are targeting 2 billion by 2050. So it's a state of preparedness that we need to encourage. And as I've said, because the MDGs did not prioritize higher education, I personally feel that we have lost 20 years. And I think it's time now to start investing and consider these funds which are going to go into these spaces as investment and not as expenses.
Thank you so much, Professor, for those insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Microfinance institutions are known as the bank for the poor, but microfinance fraud seems to be a trend in recent times in some parts of Africa. Customers in Congo recently lost over 300,000 euros, while Nigerians have lost over 46 million euros in investment in microcredits. Here is more to that story.
What do you do if a microfinance institution promises 200% interest on savings deposited after 78 days? For many, this is an opportunity that's too good to refuse. But could it also be too good to be true? Well, in the Republic of Congo, hundreds of customers of Crédit Mutuel d'Afrique, a microfinance institution, learned the hard way. After collecting some 300,000 euros in customer deposits, the firm is unable to pay. For the many who invested their life savings, it is another painful reminder of the reality of Ponzi schemes in Africa's banking sector. Schemes that promise investment returns suspiciously higher than market rates.
Central banks are basically the best line of defense when it comes to financial fraud and financial scams. That's why a lot of things can happen, but central banks make sure that even in a corrupt country, central banks make sure that at least the banks do not get away with scamming people. So that is one of the few places where you might not get scammed in Africa, luckily.
As more and more people access financial markets through innovative such as mobile money and digital currencies, it is important to also invest in the safety of deposits and transactions.
When the world shut down in March last year, global supply chains were massively disrupted as movement of people were severely restricted. Total and partial lockdowns have since been lifted in many African countries. And yet, because of the successive variants, waves, and individual countries' efforts to recover from the pandemic, global producers and transport systems are struggling to meet demand. The result, shortages of critical goods like cooking gas in Nigeria and medicines across the continent.
The disruption of global production and supply chains by the COVID-19 pandemic and accompanying restrictions has caused shortages of critical goods and services. While Africa only accounts for about 4% of global trade, it is not immune to these shocks in the supply chains. According to the OECD, Africa imports a staggering 90% of their pharmaceutical products from outside the continent, that which has now been severely affected by the pandemic. Nigeria, which has the continent's largest gas reserves, is experiencing shortages of liquefied natural gas, LNG, used for cooking. The country relies on imported LNG, and factors like the reintroduction of taxes on energy and the depreciation of the naira have compounded the shortage. But this in itself shines a spotlight and raises questions on the restart of the manufacturing and logistics machine that moved raw materials and products from one end of the world to the other, which analysts say is proving to now be extremely difficult.
Before we sign out, here's a quick look at some major business news around the continent. This week, Nigeria became the first African government to issue a digital currency. The e-Naira is built on blockchain technology to address counterfeit concerns, but it's important to note that the e-Naira is not a cryptocurrency. With this currency, millions of Nigerians who do not have a bank account but have a mobile phone will easily access financial services. Ghana is expected to follow suit with the cedi. Meanwhile, countries in the Southern African regional bloc have called for the unconditional and immediate lifting of all sanctions against the Bambuan government. Malawian president, speaking on behalf of 16 countries, said the prolonged sanctions have hindered Zimbabwe's economic recovery, human security, and sustainable growth. Also, African continent continues to demonstrate resilience amidst the devastating pandemic. The latest commercial market outlook by Boeing shows that airlines in Africa will grow their fleets by 3.6% per year to accommodate passenger traffic growth of 5.4% annually, the third highest growth rate in the world. And that's a wrap for Business Africa this week. We have more business news and powerful stories of entrepreneurs on our various platforms at Africanews and Africanews.com. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.